All right, let's dive in. We've got a really interesting set of sources here, all tackling this core idea, divine grace.
Yes, it's everywhere in these kinds of discussions, isn't it? Faith, salvation.
Mm.
But these sources really show how differently people slice it, what grace is, what it does.
Exactly. And our job today, looking at what you've pulled together, is to sort of unpack these views
Hmm.
and really zero in on something that jumps out from the material. Why one specific viewpoint seems, well, different. It doesn't seem to lean on grace in the same way the others do.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Your read seems spot on based on the texts.
Mm.
Pelagianism is consistently flagged in these sources as the one that stands apart on this question of needing divine grace.
Okay, good. Let's start right there then. Pelagianism. What is it about this view, according to these sources, that makes it the exception?
Well, the sources are quite direct. It boils down to two main things: denying original sin
Okay.
and denying total depravity.
Ah, okay. So right there, that's a fundamental split noted in the sources. If humans aren't born, inherently flawed or unable to choose good because of sin,
Right, which is often what total depravity gets at, that inability without God's help.
then what does Pelagianism emphasize instead?
It pivots, according to these texts, straight to the absolute freedom of the human will. The idea is that people can achieve righteousness, can avoid sin, just by their own efforts. The capacity is already there.
Mm. But wait, did Pelagius completely deny any kind of grace from God? Was it just all human effort?
That's a good clarifying question. The sources point out a nuance. He might have acknowledged grace in, say, God giving the law, or maybe forgiveness if someone did sin.
Right.
But the key criticism highlighted in the material is that he denied the need for what's called cooperative grace.
Cooperative grace. Okay, what did the sources say that means?
It's defined as God's help specifically for the will, help to choose the good or to actually do good deeds.
Ah,
So Pelagianism, as it's presented and criticized in these sources, didn't see God needing to step in and sort of empower the will itself for moral action.
got it. So the criticism based on the texts is essentially this view says humans can choose good, can follow God, without divine intervention enabling that very choice or action. They just can do it.
Precisely. It's seen as minimizing God's act of grace by maximizing inherent human ability. And the sources link this directly to why it was historically condemned,
Okay.
because it didn't attribute the very beginning of faith, the initial turn towards God, to God's grace.
That's a critical point from the historical context in the sources.
Mhm.
And they even draw a line to modern critiques, right? Mentioning views seen as akin to full-throated Pelagianism.
Yes, specifically when those views deny the need for a supernatural change within a person to even enable them to respond positively to God.
Right. So Pelagianism, as presented, rejects that idea that the fallen human will needs God to do something first to make a positive response possible. The sources say this view argues the will is basically fine.
And that foundational difference really sets it apart from the other perspectives discussed in your materials.
Yeah, it seems like a stark contrast.
Because those other views, Arminianism, Calvinism, and so on, they all explicitly make grace fundamental, even if they, understand it quite differently.
Okay, let's pivot to those then. How do these other views bring grace into the picture? Let's start with Arminianism. The sources mention classical or Wesleyan views here, and they note it does affirm total depravity, unlike Pelagianism.
Right, and that's a key shared starting point with, say, Calvinism. Human inability because of sin.
So how does grace work here?
In Arminianism, according to the sources, salvation gets started by God's grace, specifically something called prevenient grace.
Prevenient grace. And the sources describe that as what? Going out to everyone?
Yes, exactly. Extended to all people. The idea is it restores enough spiritual ability, light, enabling people to understand spiritual things and actually turn to God, respond to the gospel call.
So it enables the response.
It prepares the way. The sources characterize conversion here as God-initiated synergism.
Meaning?
God acts first with this enabling grace, then the person cooperates, using the ability grace provided. So grace is absolutely central. It makes the response possible in the first place.
Okay, that's clear. So Arminian grace enables the will. What about Calvinism? The sources say it also affirms total depravity. How does grace function there?
Calvinism, as presented, focuses on God's special or saving grace. And the sources stress this is different from common grace. It's given only to the elect.
Only the elect. And this special grace, The sources describe it as effectual
Yeah.
or irresistible.
Yes, those terms come up, meaning it doesn't just enable a possible response. It actually infallibly brings about faith and salvation in those specific individuals God chose. It secures the outcome.
So it guarantees it, unlike the enabling grace in Arminianism.
That's the distinction the materials draw. Now, Calvinism also talks about common grace. The sources define that as more general blessings, God's care for creation, restraining sin in society, things that benefit everyone, elect or not.
Okay, so common grace is broad, but in the Calvinist system described, it's not the grace that actually saves or enables saving faith.
Right, that's the role of special, effectual grace. But both kinds of grace are important concepts in that view, according to the sources.
Right. Okay, moving on. The sources also touch on historical semi-Pelagianism. Now, how does this fit? The sources say, crucially, it did accept grace was necessary for salvation, unlike Pelagianism proper.
Yes, that's a vital distinction the texts make. They weren't saying you could do it entirely on your own. They agreed grace was needed.
There was a catch, right? What was the key difference according to the sources?
The difference was about the start. Semi-Pelagianism, as described, held that the initiation of faith, that first step, came from the human will. Then grace comes in to help, to assist that initial human effort.
Ah, so the sequence is flipped compared to Arminianism or Calvinism. Humans start, grace helps finish.
Exactly. And the sources note, like Pelagianism, this view was also historically condemned,
Why?
because the councils that addressed it affirmed that grace must initiate faith. It has to be God's work from the very beginning, not just a helper coming in later.
Okay, so condemned for the order of operations, essentially. But the sources still contrast it with Pelagianism because...
Because it did appeal to grace as necessary.
Yeah.
It wasn't denying the need for divine aid altogether, just arguing about when that aid becomes primary or necessary. It still saw grace as essential for the whole process, unlike the Pelagian view described as minimizing or denying enabling grace.
That distinction is helpful. Okay, finally, the sources mention provisionism linked to Mr. Flowers. How does grace work in this view based on the material?
Here, the emphasis is on God's initiative in providing the atonement universally and then freely offering the gospel message through the Holy Spirit. That action of providing and offering is identified as grace.
So the grace is in the provision, the offer itself.
Yes. But what seems key, reading the sources, is what this view denies compared to, say, Arminianism or Calvinism. It denies that Adam's sin totally incapacitated the free will, in the sense meant by total depravity in those other systems.
Okay, so what does it assert instead?
The sources say it asserts that fallen people retain actual free will, defined as the ability to choose between options, like accepting or rejecting the offer.
Implying they don't need that prior internal work of grace, that supernatural change or an enabling to make a positive choice.
That seems to be the implication described. They can respond positively to the freely offered gospel using the will they already possess.
Right. And the sources do mention critics argue this minimizes that necessary enabling aspect of grace for a fallen will.
Yes, compared to the other systems.
But the provisionist system itself, as presented in the material, clearly calls God's act of providing and offering grace.
Correct. It frames grace differently.
Okay, so this really brings us back around, doesn't it? Looking at all these views presented in the sources. Pelagianism genuinely stands out.
It does. It's consistently presented as the view that minimizes or even denies the necessity of divine grace for enabling the fallen will to choose good or to initiate salvation. It posits the will is inherently capable.
Right, because Arminianism, Calvinism, even historical semi-Pelagianism and provisionism, they all, in their own ways, described in the sources, incorporate grace as fundamental. It's necessary. It's central.
Their debates, as presented, are about how grace works. Its nature, its scope, its timing, its effect on the will. Is it enabling, effectual? Is it the offer itself?
But they all agree some form of divine grace is essential to the picture.
Whereas Pelagianism, as critiqued in these sources, is seen as questioning that fundamental need for grace to empower or initiate the positive response from a fallen human will. So yes, the sources absolutely back up that initial observation. Pelagianism is the distinct exception here.
So why spend time digging into these sometimes subtle distinctions from the sources? Well, it gives you, the listener, a kind of roadmap, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
It helps you navigate these conversations, understand the history, and see why people come at cultures of faith and human ability from such different angles based on their view of grace.
It unlocks the underlying assumptions. When someone talks about human potential or God's action, understanding their view of grace is often key.
Absolutely. And maybe something to leave you with thinking about this deep dive. You've seen these different pictures of grace from the sources. Does it enable the will? Does it effectually cause the will to respond? Is grace simply the provision and offer to a will that's already capable?
Big differences.
So how might those radically different starting points affect, say, how someone approaches evangelism, or what they even mean when they talk about spiritual growth or transformation? What does that look like practically, flowing from these different ideas about grace? Something for you to think about.